want to do a quick video on wire quality. These Powerwalls that we're building, some of them push a lot of amps, and so the kind of wire that you are using is actually very important. I tend to actually use smaller gauge wire than I probably should, but I kind of know what I can get away with. But if you're unsure, it never hurts to go up a gauge size. But I want to talk to you about a few things that you need to be aware of when you're picking the wiring for your project. Firstly, there are two kinds of wire: copper and aluminum. And honestly, a lot of sellers mislabel their aluminum wire as copper wire. Aluminum wire only carries about 60% of the current that copper wire can carry. So an aluminum wire actually only can carry a little more than half of the current that copper wire can carry. So if, like me, you are going to use smaller gauge wire in your builds, make sure it's pure copper, because that will have the capacity that you need. If you are using copper clad aluminum, then you are going to have to go oversize on your gauge to compensate for the aluminum. Now, I was saying that some vendors are shady, and the reason is aluminum wire is actually often coated with a thin layer of copper, and it's called copper clad aluminum, and it sometimes has the letters CCA in the description, but they will say like copper wire, 8 gauge copper wire, CCA. Well, that means it's actually aluminum with a thin layer of copper on it. And let me show you here. If you can see, this wire is silver. Okay, that wire is silver, which means this is probably aluminum. But if I strip it, it looks like copper. If I look at the wires on the side, it definitely looks like copper. That's nice, gold color, looks like copper. But if I look at the end grain, it's silver. That's because this is aluminum wire that has been coated in copper. That coating helps a little, but this is still aluminum wire and not the same as pure copper wire. This is pure copper wire here. You can see it looks copper on the side, and let's put these up side by side. It looks like copper on the end. So this is pure copper wire, and this is aluminum wire. Now again, nothing wrong with aluminum wire as long as you are not pushing what the current capabilities of the wire is. Let's quickly talk about amps and volts. When you're building Powerwalls, you're going to make two decisions about your Powerwalls. First is the voltage of the Powerwall. Secondly will be the amps of your Powerwall. That will determine the total wattage that your Powerwall can push. My 29 volt system pushes about 60 amps, which converts to about 1500 watts. And I have a 2000 watt inverter, so that's, I know everything about my system. But the important part is the 29 volts and the 60 amps. You should know that any size wire can carry high voltage. Even the thinnest stuff I have could carry, 100,000 volts. That's why, a stun gun is 100,000 volts running through tiny little wires like this. Wire size does not affect the voltage you can carry. You can carry any voltage on any gauge wire. The wire size actually affects the amps. And since a stun gun is tiny amount of amps, they can use little wires in a stun gun even though it's super high voltage. Powerwall is the opposite. We're lower voltage, but higher amps. So we need thick gauge wire. Your amp carrying capacity is directly affected by the size of the wire. This is it's about 10 or 8 gauge wire. So this is this can probably carry, and this is pure copper. So this can probably carry, 60 amps, no problems. This is 12 gauge, I think. And, wire usually has its rating on the side. This is 12 gauge. But this is 12 gauge, but does look like copper clad aluminum. So this is probably limited to 20 or 30 amps. This is also 12 gauge, but this is pure copper. So this is a good 30 amps. I wouldn't worry about 30, even maybe a little more through this. And so on and so forth. It goes down the line. So you will need to know the amps of your system to know what size wire you're going to use. And then again, if you're going to use aluminum, you're going to have to probably, you're going to have to go down a size or two on your wire gauge, because the aluminum is not going to carry the same current as the copper. To help you pick your wire size, look at your BMS. If you install a BMS, it's going to have wiring on it. This wiring will help give you an idea of the size of wiring the rest of your system is going to need. This is a 30 amp BMS, and it has 12 gauge wire. So I'm probably at least going to have to use 12 gauge for the rest of the system, since, this BMS, obviously they think that they can run the 30 amps through 12 gauge. So, 12 gauge is what I will use for the rest of the system. On my Powerwall, my 100 amp Dali BMS has 8 gauge wire on it, and so my whole system is 8 gauge. And but and obviously I'm only pushing maybe 60-70 amps, less than the BMS, which is good. But that the wiring on the BMS gives you an idea of the size of wire gauge you will have to run for the rest of the system. Now, if copper is so much better than aluminum, why not just buy pure copper? Well, pure copper is expensive. It's usually actually 3 times the price of copper-clad aluminum. So, you could buy a larger grade of aluminum wire and probably still be cheaper than the copper. The only problem then is you have thicker wires in your build, and some builds, something like if you're doing like a solar generator, and that the thickness of the wire could affect how much space you have in the box to do your solar generator. So, smaller wire is convenient and keeps the build cleaner. But again, copper is expensive. You should know that there are other factors on wire. One question that I see people ask is, what's the difference between speaker wire and power wire? The answer is nothing. Nothing. Wire is wire. It doesn't matter if it's speaker wire, power wire. It doesn't matter, as long as you are, as long as you know the gauge of the wire, what the wire is made out of, the wire will work. Now, the main difference between, say, speaker wire and power wire and that is actually often the jacket. This is actually speaker wire. This is actual speaker wire, and it's in a PVC jacket. And believe it or not, this is the exact wire that my solar panels are wired with. I used 12 gauge copper clad aluminum speaker wire for my solar panels. Okay, and this hell, I even buried it. Now, this is not rated for that. You're not supposed to do that, but we know that PVC is pretty tough, and it's in this PVC jacket, and the sun will break this down over time. But I'll probably end up replacing it at some point. If I add more panels than that, I'm going to end up having to upgrade the wire gauge. So for now, this is perfectly fine, and it was cheap. I think I got 100 feet for like $25 of this 12 gauge wire, and that wired up my solar panels perfectly. This is actually the wire I bought already to replace this. This is pure copper wire, and it's in an outdoor jacket, and this is rated for burial. So I can bury this outside and run this outside and the sun's not going to affect it and that. So this is ultimately what I'll probably replace it with if I add more panels. But for now, this works fine. I have also measured the voltage drop of the aluminum on my panels, and I lose about 4% of my power through this wire over nearly 100 feet, which is nothing. Because I am running relatively low wattage, the fact that this is aluminum doesn't really matter. Because I'm not trying to push too much current through this wire. I get a relatively low voltage drop and I only lose about 4% of the power from the solar panels to the charge controller. But remember, I put all my panels in series, so I'm running high voltage, low amps through this wire. If you had paralleled up your panels and try to run high amps through this wire, it would not work. Remember, higher amps means you need larger gauge wire. You can push higher voltage through thin wire, but you cannot push higher amps through thin wire. So, just think about, how you're going to wire your solar panels, how you're going to wire your batteries, what kind of amps are you pushing on the solar panels, what kind of amps are you pushing on your batteries, and all of that will directly dictate your sort of the wire that you are going to pick. The other factors are, some wire, this is silicone wire. It's super soft and floppy, and it's lovely to work with. And the silicone wire is heat resistant, but it is very expensive. And so I generally do use silicone wire for everything, but electrically it's not necessary. Regular wire of the same, gauge, just in a PVC jacket like this is electrically the same as silicone wire. Silicone wire is just nice to work with and takes the heat well and lays down nicely. But electrically, there's no difference between, a 12 gauge PVC jacketed wire and a 12 gauge silicone jacketed wire. Again, sometimes price comes in, if price is not a factor, of course, get pure copper silicone wire all day long. But, sometimes price is a factor, and just some regular old 12 gauge, PVC jacketed wire will work just fine. But again, keep an eye out on those sellers that are being shady and selling aluminum wire as copper. If it says CCA anywhere in the description, it is aluminum, not copper. If you see OFC, that's oxygen-free copper. That is the best kind of pure copper wire you can get, and that's excellent wire. OFC, oxygen-free copper, is the best kind of copper you can get. So if you see that, that's great. But yeah, just a quick video on different kinds of wires and the kind of amps you're going to be pushing and what you should, wire your system with. Anyways, I hope that helped. And if you like this video, please subscribe and hit the like button. Thanks.